sleet needled Alexandra Ericsson's face as she stood beneath the portico of the Winter Assembly Rooms, a silver tray balanced on both hands, and tried not to let her fingers shake hard enough to scatter the damp calling cards. March had turned mean by evening. Wind cut through wool and bone. The stone flags under her boots sweated with meltwater and street salt, and the hem of her old dove-grey gown dragged through both until the cloth hung heavy as wet rope around her ankles. Carriages rolled up in polished succession. Lamps swung from their brackets and threw pale gold over lacquered doors, black horses, bright jewels, and a hearse. Her place was half in shadow, half in view, too visible to be ignored, too low to be greeted. A footman with real wages had gone inside to warm his hands by the service hearth, so she held his post in silence while guests arrived with gloved ease and passed her like weather. The tray grew heavier each quarter hour. Cardstock drank the sleet and curled at the corners. Ink bled at family crests. She had been told to keep each name legible and each edge straight, as if paper could remain pristine while the night stung like this. Her palms were raw beneath threadbare gloves, chafed open where silver met skin. She shifted the weight to her left and felt the burn in her wrist climb to her elbow. The ache in her belly was a separate thing, more patient. At dusk, cook had set aside a heel of bread and a spoon of broth for her in the scullery. Lady Marlborough's spaniel had taken both from the chair where Alexandra left them while she was sent upstairs for shawls, and when she returned the bowl was licked clean and the bread in crumbs. No second tray had appeared. No one had asked whether she had eaten. Hunger made her sharper for an hour, then slower. By 9 o'clock it hollowed her out and left her light-headed under the lamps. Guests climbed down from coaches in silk and velvet and glanced at her with that quick, assessing look reserved for furniture that seemed almost human. A young gentleman with wet curls laughed to his companion and said not softly, "I thought Bath had standards. They station ghosts at the door now." His companion looked her over, eyes lingering on her narrow shoulders and plain bodice. Not a ghost, a warning. Two ladies in silver satin paused long enough to hand over cards with 2 fingers and exchange judgment as if she were deaf. "Too thin," one murmured. "Too dark," said the other. "Too quiet, certainly." Their laughter drifted in a pale cloud and vanished into the vestibule warmth. Alexandra lowered her eyes to the tray because meeting theirs would have granted them consequence. Still, each word landed where cold had already made her tender. Quiet. She had been called stubborn, humorless, ungrateful, severe. Quiet was the one accusation that was true and false at once. She kept silence because speech cost her. She kept it because in Lady Marlborough's house every unnecessary word could be turned into debt. Lavender reached her before the rustle of silk did. Lady Marlborough came out beneath the portico wrapped in midnight blue satin trimmed with jet, the scent of expensive rosewater and sharper lavender following her like another garment. Rain jewelled her bonnet ribbons and did not dare touch her skin. She looked Alexandra up and down with practised displeasure. "Stand straighter, you're not in a barn." Her fan tapped the tray edge. "And for heaven's sake, do not stare at people. It suggests appetite." She turned just enough for a cluster of late arrivals to hear and added, "My late husband's child had every advantage and made nothing of it. Too quiet to charm anyone. Too plain to secure a practical marriage. Too proud to be useful unless watched." A few guests smiled into their gloves. One man pretended not to hear and heard every word. Alexandra kept the tray level. The cards trembled once, then stilled. She answered in the voice Lady Marlborough despised most, low and exact. "Yes, Lady Marlborough." The older woman's gaze sharpened at the absence of apology, then slid away. She had long ago learned that Alexandra could be hurt more efficiently in front of witnesses than in private. The ballroom doors opened and closed in steady rhythm behind her. Each time they swung wide, warmth struck her face, carrying beeswax, perfume, and the high, bright thread of violins. Then the doors shut, and she was left with sleet and horse breath and the bitter tang of coal smoke from the street. Inside, chandeliers spilled light on polished floors where people moved in ordered patterns and called it grace. Outside, she counted arrivals and departures, accepted cards, directed coats, lifted dropped handkerchiefs, and stepped aside when wheels splashed mud. She performed each task before being asked, because delay invited correction and correction invited hands. Her right shoulder throbbed where Lady Marlborough had gripped it that morning hard enough to bruise through muslin. Her cheeks still held a faint heat from a slap 2 days old, given in the breakfast room for misplacing a letter that had never been in her keeping. She had learned to turn her face before mirrors so maids would not be questioned for what they might have seen. She had not always stood in doorways with servant girls and borrowed footmen. Captain Ericson's daughter had once sat at the head of a smaller table in a quieter house on Camden Crescent, where portraits of her father's Swedish kin lined the corridor, and no one entered her mother's drawing room without being announced. The year was 1824 now, and those portraits were gone, sold with the silver while Alexandra still wore mourning. Captain Ericson had died at sea in a fever storm, and left ledgers full of debts he had hidden under optimistic sums and delayed payments. Her mother had remarried within 12 months for protection, rather than affection, to a man who liked order more than kindness and feared scandal more than hunger. Then her mother died in childbirth before that second year closed, and protection became pretext. Lady Marlborough kept the house by legal manoeuvre and social certainty, sold the jewels that should have funded Alexandra's dowry, and transformed inheritance into obligation with signatures Alexandra was never permitted to read. Rooms that had once held Ericson canvases now held Marlborough mirrors. Even the nursery wallpaper had been replaced, as if memory itself could be stripped and pasted over. Yet one part of her had not been sold. At night in the attic, under the eaves, where frost etched the inside of the pane and rats moved in the wall, Alexandra kept a candle stub, a grammar, and a narrow stack of copied verse hidden in an old hat box. She translated Scandinavian poems into careful English in a hand so neat it might have belonged to a clerk. She copied household accounts from rough drafts to clean ledgers when no steward remained sober enough to finish the columns. Figures obeyed laws, people did not. A debt was either entered or concealed. A line balanced or it failed. In numbers and language she could still keep faith with the father who taught her letters before he taught her dancing, who used to say that precision was a form of honour when the world rewarded noise. Lady Marlborough called such habits affectation. Alexandra called them survival, and never allowed. Near 10 o'clock the sleet thickened into a fine, hard rain that struck the portico roof like thrown seed. A coach wheel clipped the curb and sent a fan of black water across the lower steps, soaking her skirts to the knee. Cold climbed her calves. She clenched her jaw until it hurt. A matron with emerald drops took one look at her and recoiled as if damp wool were contagious. "Not there," she told Alexandra, though Alexandra had not moved. "You are dripping." Her husband, flushed with claret, tucked the lady's arm through his and smirked down at Alexandra's face. "What did I tell you, Agnes? Bath is overrun with tragic heroines." They passed inward, and the footman, who had returned at last, accepted their cloaks from her hands without meeting her eyes. He was older than her father would have been, and he whispered as he took the tray, "Shift your grip, miss, or you will lose feeling in the fingers." Then he was gone again. Kindness, when it came in fragments and never where Lady Marlborough could witness it. By the second week of March she had learned the precise hour when her body began to betray her. It started with a tremor in the thumbs, then a small lag between instruction and movement. Lift, turn, step, bow her head. At 10:30, the tremor arrived. She tightened her grip until pain replaced it. Pain, at least, was directional. She could set it aside in a corner of herself and continue. The music changed inside to a country dance. Laughter rose, bright and careless. Someone called for more negus. Someone else called for the carriage of Lady Minton. Names floated through the vestibule as if carried on ribbons. Alexandra catalogued each one and placed each card where it belonged. She would later carry the stack upstairs, sort the embossed crests under candlelight, and enter attendance in Lady Marlborough's social book, so tomorrow's visits might be ranked according to advantage. When she finally stepped back from the door to stretch life into her fingers, the movement drew Lady Marlborough's eye from across the vestibule. "Silk," whispered. "Lavender cut through rain." "Do not drift, Alexandra. You are useful only when still." The words were mild enough for company. Their force was not. Alexandra returned to her station. She set her shoulders. She fixed her gaze just above the arriving heads, where gaslight trembled in the damp and turned black hair to blue. No one asked if she was cold. No one asked if she had eaten. She held the tray steady anyway, and the night kept taking from her in small, exact measures while the music went on. The music went on, and Alexandra stood where she was placed until her fingers numbed past pain and into a dead wooden stiffness that frightened her more than cold. She shifted the tray an inch against her palm. The silver edge caught the split skin at the base of her thumb and reopened it. Warmth slicked under wet kid leather. She kept her hand level. Inside, the violins rose bright and indifferent. Outside, sleet tapped the stone in tiny hard strokes. She watched a new line of carriages draw up and thought, with a flat, practical dread, that she would need to sort every one of these cards before dawn if Lady Marlborough wanted responses carried by breakfast. "Alexandra!" Lady Marlborough's voice cut across the vestibule. Not loud, sharper than loud. Alexandra stepped in from the portico at once. Heat hit her face, then shame because wet wool steamed in public and smelled of horse and rain. "Yes, Lady Marlborough." "You are staining the runner. Go to the retiring room and attend Miss Honoria. Her hem has torn. Be quick. The Wrexhams are expected." Alexandra passed through the edge of the ballroom, tray balanced against her hip, and the crowd opened around her without looking at her. Chandeliers burned overhead. Beeswax and perfume layered thick in the air. Men laughed with wine-flushed mouths. Women dipped and turned in silk the colour of cream and plum and watered moonlight. She did not lift her gaze above their shoulders. She knew better than to look at joy as if she might claim a portion of it. The ladies' retiring room stood warm as a greenhouse, 2 coal grates blazing, mirrors doubling every ribbon and bare neck. Miss Honoria Marlborough sat on a chaise with one slipper off, pouting at the maid kneeling before her. Her sister, Miss Lydia, stood by the dressing-table fastening earrings that had once belonged to Alexandra's mother. Not the whole set. Those had gone to a jeweller in Milsom Street the spring after the funeral. But these drops, seed pearls with tiny sapphire centres, had been kept back and renamed family property. Honoria glanced up and wrinkled her nose. "She is dripping on the carpet." Lydia did not turn. "Then place her by the door. She can dry there like an umbrella." Alexandra set the tray on a side table and knelt for the torn hem. The satin was pale green and weighted with beadwork. One split at the seam. 20 minutes with proper light would have repaired it invisibly. She had 3. "Lift your foot, miss," she said. Honoria lifted it an inch. "Do not prick me. I do not wish to limp through the cotillion on account of your clumsy hands." Alexandra threaded the needle with fingers so cold she could barely feel the eye. She worked close, fast, stitches tight and hidden. Honoria watched her as one might watch an animal trained to perform a trick. "Mother says Mr. Fenton asked whether you might be placed as companion in Kent. He has a widowed aunt who requires plain company and no opinions. You would suit her perfectly." Lydia laughed softly at the mirror. "If anyone pays for her, we should be grateful, though I cannot imagine who would. She looks like a sermon on rain." Alexandra tied off the thread and bit it clean. The pearl earring flashed when Lydia moved. That small white gleam dragged a memory out of her before she could push it away. Her mother seated by morning light with the same drops in her hand, saying, "These are yours when you marry, Lexi," and laughing when Alexandra asked whether she might keep them, even if she married no one at all. Her mother had always smelled of bergamot and starch, never lavender. Her hands had been warm even in January. "Done, miss," Alexandra said, and rose. Honoria dragged one finger across the repaired seam and found no bump to criticise. "At least she can sew. Father always said Captain Ericsson taught her useless things. Latin verbs, sea maps. Look where it led him." Lydia fitted the second earring and finally looked full at Alexandra's face. Debt led him. Everyone knows that now. He smiled, he borrowed, he promised, and he left us to settle accounts. Left us. The pronoun landed like grit between teeth. Captain Ericsson had never borrowed from Marlborough money. He had borrowed against cargo that sank, against contracts delayed, against voyages he did not survive to complete. But he had left ledgers behind with numbers in his own careful hand, and numbers could be made to accuse the dead as easily as the living. Alexandra picked up the tray. "Lady Marlborough asked me to return to the door." "Then return," Lydia said, "and keep your eyes lowered. Men mistake still water for depth." She curtsied because refusal would cost more than obedience, then carried the cards back through the corridor. Each step measured to keep her skirts from slapping rain onto polished boards. At the vestibule threshold, Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, caught her elbow for a breath-long second and pressed something small into her palm. A folded square of clean linen. No words. Mrs. Davies's eyes moved once to Alexandra's bleeding glove, then away. Compassion in that house survived by refusing to be witnessed. Alexandra tucked the linen into her sleeve and resumed her post under the portico. Wind found the wet seam at her shoulder and slid through it like a blade. She leaned the tray against the stone balustrade for one heartbeat, peeled off the glove, and wrapped her palm tight enough to blunt the sting. Blood seeped through anyway in a narrow, dark flower. She put the glove back on. Carriages came and went. Names arrived embossed in gold. She sorted them by family as she received them. Marlborough allies to the left, uncertain invitations to the right, obligations in the centre where Lady Marlborough could see them first. A gentleman from Queen Square handed over his card and frowned at her face as if trying to place it in an older room. "Ericsson," he said before he could stop himself, "you are Captain Ericsson's girl." "I am Alexandra Ericsson, sir." He looked over her shoulder toward the glow inside and lowered his voice. "Your father once pulled my brother out of a storm off Bergen. Nearly lost his own hand in the rigging for it. His throat worked once. He was a brave man." Then he straightened as if he had said too much to the wrong person in the wrong place and went in without waiting for an answer. The door closed behind him. Wind swallowed the brief warmth his words had opened. She stood very still. Brave did not settle debts. Brave did not return settlements diverted to other names. Brave did not feed a daughter whose supper could be given to a dog by accident or design and never replaced. Yet for one moment, beneath sleet and lamp smoke, her father had been spoken of as flesh and courage instead of columns and failure, and her chest ached with gratitude so sharp it felt like injury. By midnight, the schedule of humiliations had arranged itself as precisely as the dance order posted by the orchestra stand. Mockery at arrivals, studied neglect through the first set, a public correction before supper, and then the command that would send her upstairs with social books to copy until dawn. Tonight had unfolded along that same line. A little after 11, Lady Marlborough drifted out again, a fan half open, diamonds burning at her throat. She took the tray without thanks, scanned the pile and flicked one card against Alexandra's bodice. "Why is this among accepted calls?" Alexandra looked. Mrs. Penhall's card. Widow. Respectable. Modest means. Her daughter needed a French tutor. "Mrs. Penhall was invited last quarter, Lady Marlborough. You instructed me to mark her favourable." That was before her son invested poorly. We do not cultivate decline. The card struck Alexandra's shoulder this time. Correct it. If your father had understood such distinctions, we might all have been spared inconvenience. Inconvenience! The word for a sold house, a stripped dowry. A girl in wet wool at a door. Alexandra bent and retrieved the card before the rain could blot the name. "Yes, Lady Marlborough." Lady Marlborough's gaze slid to Alexandra's sleeve where the linen edge showed, then to the glove dark at the palm. "Have you injured yourself?" "It is nothing." "It had best be. You are of little use broken." Lavender moved past her into the night, and the silk hem whispered over stone. The cards blurred once, not from tears, from exhaustion. She blinked hard until letters steadied. She could not afford tears in cold air. They froze at the lashes and advertised weakness. She pressed the stack flat and thought of her mother's final winter instead, because that pain came cleaner than this one. Her mother in a high bed with curtains drawn, cheeks too bright, hands searching for Alexandra's in the dark while the new husband paced outside and spoke in low, urgent tones about physicians' fees. "You must be prudent," her mother had whispered, breath thin as paper. "Learn where the papers are kept. Do not sign anything you have not read." Then fever took coherence from her. Within a month she was buried. Within 2 months keys changed hands. Within 3, Alexandra was moved from the blue room to an attic under broken slates, because the blue room was needed for guests. She had found the household ledgers the following autumn, stacked in the old gun cupboard, and copied figures by moonlight until she understood what had happened to her mother's settlement. Transfers entered on dates Lady Marlborough had been in London. Signatures that resembled her stepfather's hand and did not match it in pressure or slant. Payments to firms that did not exist outside ink. She had hidden those copies inside a grammar of Swedish declensions, because no one in that house opened foreign books. She had kept adding to them, each quarter, line by line, patient as frost. Not revenge. Record. If no one believed a quiet woman speaking, perhaps they might one day believe columns that balanced too neatly to be honest. Rain slackened toward a mist after midnight. The portico lamps hissed. Somewhere deep inside the assembly rooms, a cork flew and men cheered. Mrs. Davies crossed once with a basket of empty glasses and paused long enough to murmur, "There is tea cooling by the back range when your shift ends, miss, if cook does not see." "Thank you. Do not thank me where others hear." Mrs. Davies moved on. Alexandra held the tray and watched the last rank of carriages pull away from the curb, wheels cutting black arcs through slush. Her feet had gone beyond cold into a heavy numbness. Her shoulder burned. Her cheek throbbed in memory more than pain. In the glass pane beside the door she caught a pale reflection of herself. Dark hair escaped at the temples, mouth set, eyes too large in a thin face people called plain because they had no use for the kind of beauty that looked back. Inside, laughter crashed and faded. Outside, she counted what remained hers with the precision her father had taught her. A mind that could still order figures. 2 languages no one could confiscate. A hidden packet of copied accounts in an attic hat box. A voice she spent carefully and therefore still possessed. She adjusted her grip once more and stood straight beneath the portico, while the night and the house that had been hers continued to demand payment. Payment was demanded again within minutes, and this time it came with an audience. Lady Marlborough returned through the vestibule doors in a sweep of blue satin, her fan closed now, her mouth set in the thin line that meant she had found a use for anger and intended to spend it. And 2 women lingered near the cloak stand, waiting for their coach to be called. A cluster of gentlemen stood by the wall mirror with glasses in hand. Alexandra saw all of them in one glance and understood too late that whatever was coming had been chosen for witnesses. Lady Marlborough stopped an arm's length away and held out her hand. "Your reticule." Alexandra's stomach tightened. "For what purpose, Lady Marlborough?" "For the purpose of obedience. Do not test me in public. Your reticule." The old beaded bag hung from Alexandra's wrist beneath the tray. It held a pencil stub, a scrap of twine, and one folded note she had read so often the centre crease had gone soft. She had told herself she would answer it after the assembly ended, by dawn, in the careful clerk's hand. No one in this house believed she possessed. A bookseller on Cheap Street, a request for 2 translated poems, and a promise of discreet payment if the work was good. 6 shillings for the first set, enough to buy paper, mending thread, and food she could keep hidden. Enough to prove that language might yet earn what bloodline had not. She could not refuse. Refusal would become spectacle of a different kind. She shifted the tray to her left hand and passed over the reticule. Lady Marlborough opened it at once. Her fingers found the folded sheet as if they had been seeking only that. She read the first line, then the second, and a flush climbed her throat above the diamonds. "What is this?" "A private correspondence, Lady Marlborough." "Private," Lady Marlborough laughed without mirth. "You possess nothing private under my roof." She raised the page between 2 gloved fingers, so the ladies by the cloak stand could see the hand and seal. "A bookseller. You solicit employment like a shop girl and hide it in your sleeve. You presume to traffic in letters while leaving on my charity." Alexandra felt the blood beat hard at her bruised cheek. "I sought no impropriety. It is translation work, respectable and paid by commission." "Paid?" Lady Marlborough stepped closer. Lavender struck like acid in the warm air. "You are fed and housed. That is payment." "Fed." The word almost made Alexandra laugh. Hunger moved inside her like a second pulse. She heard her own voice, answer, low and even, because she had learned that calm could wound where pleading failed. "I am fed when it pleases you, Lady Marlborough. I am housed where rain comes through the slates. I am not paid." The fan rose and fell before anyone seemed to understand it had moved. The strike landed across Alexandra's already tender cheek, sharp enough to turn her head, and send the tray edge into the stone balustrade with a ringing crack. Calling cards leaped and scattered over wet flags like pale birds shot from the sky. A silence opened in the vestibule. It lasted 1 breath. Then whispers began. Lady Marlborough's voice carried cleanly through them. "Leave this room before I have you turned into the street." Alexandra straightened by force. Heat flooded one side of her face. The other had gone cold. She bent to gather the fallen cards because dignity in that house had always meant finishing the task while injured. Her glove slipped on wet stone. The folded note drifted from Lady Marlborough's hand and landed near the threshold, where Meltwater crept toward the ink. "Do not touch it," Lady Marlborough said. She ground the paper beneath her heel until the fibres tore. "There is your enterprise." From inside the ballroom music faltered, stumbled, then stopped altogether. The abrupt absence of violins was more alarming than any shout. For a heartbeat the whole building seemed to listen. Then a child cried out. It was a small sound and a terrible one. High, ragged, cut short. Alexandra lifted her head. The cry came again, strangled this time from the corridor beyond the ballroom arch where the staircase curved toward the card rooms. People turned in confusion. A lady gasped. A glass shattered against marble. No one moved with purpose. They looked to one another first, as if rank might assign responsibility. The tray dropped from Alexandra's hands and struck the floor. Silver clanged once and spun. She was already running. She crossed the vestibule, skirt hem slapping her soaked ankles, and shouldered through silk and broadcloth toward the stair rail. A boy in miniature evening coat lay half on his side against the bottom step, eyes wide with panic, fingers clawing at his own throat. Sugared almond paste streaked his cuff. His face had gone from red to an alarming dusk beneath the powder at his temples. A nursemaid knelt beside him, weeping and useless with fear. A footman hovered with both hands raised and no idea where to place them. "Move back," Alexandra said, and when no one obeyed quickly enough, she said it again with steel. "Back! Give him air!" Perhaps it was the tone. Perhaps it was that she was already on her knees and therefore looked like command-made flesh. Space opened around her. She pulled off one torn glove with her teeth, turned the boy carefully, and braced him forward over her arm. "Can you hear me?" she asked close to his ear. His answer was a choking convulsion that produced no breath. She struck between his shoulder blades with precise force once, twice, 3 times, pausing to feel for change. Nothing. The nursemaid sobbed his name. Someone whispered, "Ashbourne's nephew." Another voice answered, "God preserve us." Alexandra shifted position, wrapped her arms around the child from behind, and drove an upward pressure beneath his ribs as Captain Ericsson had once taught her for drowning sailors hauled blue from freezing water. She had been 14 on a pitching deck, terrified and stubborn, repeating the motion against a burlap sack, while her father corrected her hands. "Not there, Lexi, here, again, again until breath returns." She did it now, once, twice. On the third effort, the obstruction came free in a wet cough and struck the stair tread. The boy dragged in air like a man pulled through a broken surface. Sound tore out of him, raw but living. His body shook with sobs and breath. Alexandra held him steady against her shoulder, counted the inhalations, and waited for the rhythm to settle. Her own hands had begun to tremble so violently, she locked her wrists to hide it. "Slowly," she murmured. "That is right. You are safe. Breathe with me." Boots struck marble behind the ring of onlookers. Not hurried, deliberate, heavy enough that people shifted aside without being asked. Alexandra looked up over the child's dark head and saw him crossing the crowded room in 10 measured strides, coat open at the throat as if he had left conversation mid-sentence and not cared whom he offended by it. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair damp at the temples from the weather, face cut hard as quarried stone, eyes the colour of storm water under winter light. Everyone in Bath knew that face even if they had never stood this near it. Julian Thorne, Duke of Ashbourne. He stopped directly before her and took in the scene in one cold sweep. The boy in her arms, the crushed sweet on the stair, her bare hand reddened by force, the blood-dark patch soaking through the palm of her remaining glove, and finally her cheek where Lady Marlborough's mark had risen bright against her pale skin. His jaw tightened. He said only, "Do not move." The words fell like a battlefield order. Around them conversation died to a hush. Alexandra did not stand. She did not curtsy. The boy still clung to her sleeve, shuddering with aftershocks, and she would not loose him to satisfy etiquette. "He can breathe now, Your Grace," she said. Her voice scraped at the edges from cold and strain. "He must remain upright for a little while." The Duke crouched, one knee to marble, an action so unexpected that two matrons near the arch made identical startled sounds. He touched the boy's shoulder, not yet taking him. "Edmund!" The child flinched, then recognised the voice and reached toward him with a shaking hand. "Uncle!" Only then did Alexandra release her hold by degrees. The Duke lifted Edmund against his chest with controlled care, as if handling glass under pressure. His gaze returned to Alexandra's face. "Who are you?" "Alexandra Erickson, Your Grace." "Are you a physician?" "No, Your Grace." "Then who taught you that manoeuvre?" "My father served at sea. He taught me what to do when a man cannot draw breath." Something moved behind the Duke's eyes and vanished before it could be named. He stood, the child on his arm, and spoke over her shoulder to the nearest servant without looking away from her. "Summon Dr. Hale, now!" A footman ran. Lady Marlborough had recovered herself enough to glide forward into the circle, smile fixed, voice coated with concern. "Your Grace, what a frightful accident! My dependent overstepped in the confusion. She has always possessed a theatrical streak." Alexandra felt the room tilt slightly, not from dizziness now, but from the old fury of being rewritten while present. She kept her gaze on the child. Edmund's breathing was still ragged. His small hand had scraped against the stair on the way down. Blood beaded across his palm in thin, bright lines. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "his hand requires binding before he rubs grit into it." Lady Marlborough cut in at once. "You have done quite enough." The Duke turned his head toward Lady Marlborough for the first time. Silence. One word, flat. Absolute. Lady Marlborough's smile faltered. "Cravat," Alexandra said to no one in particular, and a young gentleman near the stair, white-faced with shock, tugged off his neckcloth and offered it with shaking fingers. She took it, tore a clean strip free, and reached for Edmund's hand. The Duke lowered the child without argument, watching every movement. She rinsed grit away with water from a spilled wine cooler, then wrapped the palms snugly but not tight, knotting the cloth at the wrist where it would not press the scrape. Her fingers were clumsy with cold. She hid it by working faster. Edmund hiccuped once and whispered, "I am sorry." "For what?" Alexandra asked. "For spoiling the music." Her throat closed briefly. "Music may be restarted. Breathing may not. You were brave." When she looked up, the Duke was still watching her, with that same unnerving concentration, as if the rest of the room had fallen away. He spoke to Edmund without lifting his gaze from Alexandra. "You will thank Miss Erickson." "Thank you, miss," the boy whispered. Alexandra inclined her head. "You are welcome." Lady Marlborough made one last attempt at possession. "Your Grace, if you will return the child to his family, I shall remove Miss Erickson at once. She is overwrought. The blood is from her own clumsiness, with a tray. I assure you there is no cause for concern." The Duke's attention dropped to Alexandra's hand, then rose to the livid print, brightening her cheekbone. His voice remained quiet, which made it more dangerous. "Liar!" Lady Marlborough drew herself up. "I beg your pardon." Your glove is blood-soaked. Your face bears fresh injury. You were struck. He did not ask it as a question. He delivered it as record. No one answered. The vestibule held its breath with Alexandra. Dr. Hale arrived at a run, bag swinging, and the circle broke as he knelt to examine Edmund. The boy, now breathing steadily, leaned against his uncle's side and submitted to inspection with tired dignity. "No lasting harm," the doctor said after a moment. "A bruised throat, abrasion to the hand. He should be watched through the night." The Duke gave a short nod. He shifted Edmund into the crook of one arm and looked down at Alexandra, where she remained on the marble floor, skirt soaked, hair loosened at the temples, one glove missing, cheek burning under every eye in Bath. "You will remain," he said. She started to rise from habit. "Lady Marlborough ordered me removed." His expression did not change. "You will remain where I can see you." The words held her in place more effectively than any hand at her wrist. Alexandra rose carefully from the marble, one knee protesting, wet skirt pulling at her legs. Around her the vestibule resumed a brittle imitation of motion. Gentlemen cleared throats. Ladies adjusted gloves. No one met her eyes for long. Dr. Hale wrapped a wool scarf lightly at Edmund's throat and asked for warm water, no sweets, no excitement, as if the room had not just witnessed a child nearly die and a woman publicly struck. Lady Marlborough recovered first. Silk whispered as she stepped nearer. Smile reset into social composure. "Your Grace, you are generous, but Miss Erikson is overtired. I shall take her home and send proper thanks in the morning." Edmund, small hand fisted in the Duke's sleeve, made a strained sound. "No, please, let her stay." The Duke did not look at Lady Marlborough when he answered. "The boy has spoken." "Children are impressionable," Lady Marlborough said. "He clings to the nearest face." Now he looked at her. The force of it silenced even the men pretending not to listen. "He clings to the face that kept him breathing." A footman appeared with warm water and linen. Dr. Hale reached for the basin, but Edmund turned away from him and toward Alexandra with the stubborn, frightened trust of a child who had selected his safety and would not surrender it. She stepped forward before permission could be debated and took the cloth. "May I, Master Edmund?" He nodded once. She knelt again so she would not tower over him. The scrape on his palm was shallow but dirty. She cleaned it in small, patient strokes until the grit lifted. He hissed when it stung. She lowered her voice and gave him numbers to follow, a quiet cadence beneath the noise of the room. "In for 4, hold for 2, out for 4. Again!" By the 3rd cycle his shoulders dropped. By the 5th he stopped shaking. The Duke watched every movement. He stood very still with one gloved hand resting against the child's back, as if he had taught himself that stillness was the safest form of care. Dr. Hale examined the hand once more and nodded his approval with reluctant surprise. "That will do. Keep it clean and dry. He must be kept calm for the rest of the evening." "Then he will not remain in this crush," the Duke said. He turned to Alexandra. "You will come." Lady Marlborough took a step forward. "Your Grace, that is not suitable." "Suitability ceased to govern this room some minutes ago." The rebuke landed cleanly. A few heads lowered at once. Alexandra felt heat rise beneath her bruised skin, not from shame this time, but from the peril of being singled out under so many eyes. Visibility had always preceded punishment in her life. She did not know what it preceded in his. They moved through a side corridor into a smaller card parlour lined in dark green paper. Its fire half burned down to red coals. The door shut behind them. Noise from the ballroom dulled to a distant pulse of strings and conversation. Here the air smelled of coal, damp wool, and spilled claret. Dr. Hale set out his instruments on a side table. The Duke placed Edmund on a settee and crouched so their faces were level. "Does your throat close now?" Edmund swallowed carefully. "No, uncle." "Pain?" "A little. You will say if that changes." Edmund nodded, then looked to Alexandra again. "Will you read?" The request struck her with unexpected force. Read, not serve, not carry, not disappear. Read. "If there is a book, Master Edmund." The Duke crossed to a narrow shelf by the mantel and returned with a worn volume of travel sketches someone had left behind in a previous season. He handed it to her without comment. His fingers were cold where they brushed her knuckles through wet cloth. She sat at the far edge of the settee, leaving proper distance, and opened to the first page with intact binding. Her voice entered the room low and steady, the same voice Lady Marlborough called useless. She read of coastal winds and northern harbours, of ships pressing through grey water under gulls. Edmund listened, with his head tilted toward her, breathing easier each minute, one bandaged hand tucked against his waistcoat. Dr. Hale packed his bag, and after a brief murmur to the Duke, withdrew to attend other alarms that wealth considered urgent. Lady Marlborough did not withdraw. She remained near the door with both daughters, a tableau of injured dignity. Honoria stared openly at Alexandra's wet hem and blood-marked glove. Lydia watched the Duke instead, calculating. "You are kind, Your Grace," Lady Marlborough said at length, each syllable polished. "Miss Erikson has always had a talent for attracting pity through silence." Alexandra kept her place on the page. She would not answer. To defend herself would make the charge appear arguable. The Duke answered for her. "I do not traffic in pity, Lady Marlborough." Lydia attempted a lighter tone. "Then perhaps in drama, Your Grace. Bath thrives on it." His gaze shifted to her with glacial courtesy. "Bath may thrive on what it likes. My household does not." No one spoke after that. The fire settled with a soft collapse. Alexandra read on. Her throat was dry and her cheek throbbed in rhythm with her pulse, yet her voice did not break. Edmund's lashes grew heavy. Once, midway through a paragraph, his head tipped sideways and came to rest against her sleeve. She did not move. By the time the supper interval ended and dancers were being called back to the floor, the child had fallen asleep against her arm. A discreet knock sounded. A young maid in assembly livery entered, carrying a fresh pot of hot water and clean cloths, eyes lowered. She could not have been more than 16. Her cap sat crooked with haste. "For Master Edmund, Your Grace." She set the tray down too quickly. One cup rocked, spilled, and splashed across the parquet at Lady Marlborough's feet. Honoria drew back with a sharp gasp. "Clumsy thing!" The maid froze. Colour drained from her face. "Forgive me, miss. I beg pardon." Lady Marlborough's expression sharpened with immediate opportunity. "Name?" "Nora Pike, my lady." "Remember it," Lady Marlborough said to no one and everyone. "Careless girls spill in parlours. Careless girls hand sweets to children who choke. Careless girls are sent off without references." Nora's hands began to shake so violently that the spoons on the tray clicked together. "I did not, my lady. I did not give—" A senior footman appeared behind her, stern with institutional fear. "Nora, outside, now!" Edmund stirred at the raised voices. Alexandra closed the book quietly and eased her arm free. She saw the maid's terror and recognised it in her bones. The terror of one accusation becoming a life sentence because no one important wished to hear a correction. "Stop!" she said. The room turned toward her. She stood, ignoring the pull of cold fabric at her knees. "If there is blame for sweets, place it on me." Nora looked up, startled into silence. Lady Marlborough's mouth curved. At last, honesty. Alexandra did not glance at her. She addressed the footman and the Duke with equal clarity. "I passed through the refreshment corridor earlier. A dish of sugared almonds was set unguarded at child height. Any boy could have taken one. Any servant could be ruined for it after the fact. The fault is not this girl's." The footman frowned. "Miss, were you in that corridor?" She held his gaze. "Yes." It was true in the narrow sense. She had crossed it once with cards. She had not seen Edmund take anything, but she saw precisely what would happen if she did not widen blame until it could no longer crush one person at the bottom. Nora would be dismissed before dawn. Dismissal without reference in Bath meant hunger by week's end. Lady Marlborough gave a soft, satisfied breath. "You hear her. She admits impropriety in service passages and interference in household order. Shall I send for her cloak now, Your Grace?" The Duke had said nothing yet. He stood near the mantel, one hand braced on the stone, eyes fixed on Alexandra with that same unnerving concentration he had turned on her at the stair. She could not read his expression. Anger and assessment sat too close together in his face. He spoke, at last, to the footman. "No one is dismissed tonight." "My lord, the Assembly steward will require—" "I am aware of what he requires." His tone did not rise. "He will receive my written statement before midnight, remove the sweet trays from all public corridors, post a servant at each table where children may pass. Miss Pike remains employed." Nora made a broken sound that might have been gratitude, then pressed her lips together hard enough to blanch them, and curtsied with shaking knees. "Yes, Your Grace." When she turned to go, Alexandra caught the girl's sleeve for a breath and tucked the fallen spoon back into her tray so she would not be scolded again in the hall. Nora's eyes shone. She fled before anyone could see. Lady Marlborough's voice cooled to ice. "Your Grace chooses to be deceived." The Duke looked at her as if she were weather he had already endured. "I choose not to feed fear as entertainment." He moved to Edmund, adjusted the blanket at the child's shoulder, and touched 2 fingers lightly to the bandage Alexandra had tied. The knot held. Lydia tried once more, softer, as if reason might reclaim him where status had failed. "You cannot mean to credit every claim made by a dependent in distress." His answer came without ornament. "I credit what I observe." The words settled over the room with the weight of verdict. Lady Marlborough's daughters fell silent. The violins in the distant ballroom resumed, faint through 2 closed doors. The night was continuing as if order had not cracked. Edmund woke briefly, disoriented, and reached for Alexandra's hand. She gave it. He whispered, throat rough, "Do not go yet." "I am here," she said. He slept again. A quarter-hour later, Dr. Hale returned, examined the boy's breathing once more, and declared him stable enough to travel if wrapped warmly and kept upright in the carriage. The Duke nodded, then issued practical instructions with military precision. "My coach to the side entrance. Blankets, a covered lantern. Send word to Ashbourne House that the nursery fire is to be built now." Orders flew outward. Servants moved. Lady Marlborough drew herself to full height. "Miss Erickson comes with me." Alexandra felt her body brace by instinct, shoulders tightening for the next private cost of public disobedience. The Duke answered before she could. "Miss Erickson will accompany my nephew as far as Ashbourne House, at his physician's recommendation, to keep him calm during transit." Dr. Hale blinked at being drafted and, after the smallest pause, inclined his head. Yes, a familiar voice would be prudent. Lady Marlborough's fan snapped shut. "Prudent for whom?" "For the child," the Duke said, "unless you object to that priority." No one in a room full of witnesses could answer such a question honestly and keep standing. Lady Marlborough smiled with visible effort. "Naturally not." Alexandra should have spoken then. She should have declined, protected herself from the danger of entering a duke's carriage under aristocratic scrutiny, protected what remained of her narrow social safety. Instead, she looked at Edmund's sleeping face, at the faint bruise beginning along his throat, and heard again his earlier plea, small and hoarse, "Let her stay." Choice narrowed to one line she could live with. "If it is required, I will come, Your Grace." His eyes held hers for one beat too long for comfort. "It is required." As servants gathered wraps and lanterns, she bent to retrieve the travel book from the settee. A folded scrap slid from its pages and landed by her shoe. She stooped, expecting a discarded dance list, and saw the torn corner of her ruined note from the vestibule, the bookseller's seal still visible despite the heel mark through the ink. Someone had picked it up from the whetstone and tucked it into the book she had been given. She did not look around to ask who. She slipped the fragment into her sleeve, rose, and took her place beside the sleeping child, while the Duke opened the parlour door and said, in the same clipped tone that had first frozen her where she stood, "Stay near me." She moved when he moved. The corridor outside the card parlour seemed narrower than it had minutes ago, crowded with bodies that pretended to pass and did not pass at all. Faces turned, fans paused mid-air. A captain in dress uniform stepped back too slowly and forced Alexandra to angle around him with Edmund's blanket tucked high under the child's chin. The Duke walked at her shoulder, not touching her, yet no one came within arm's reach. His presence cut a path through silk and black broadcloth as cleanly as a blade through ribbon. "Lantern higher," he said to the footman ahead. The man obeyed at once. Light climbed the panelled walls and caught gilt frames, polished mahogany, the wet shine of Alexandra's hem. Her shoes left faint marks on the runner. She felt each one like a rebuke. At the turn toward the side vestibule, Lady Marlborough appeared again with both daughters behind her, lavender and jewels and offended dignity. "Your Grace, at least permit my carriage to follow. Miss Erikson has no outer cloak suitable for your household." The Duke did not break stride. "Then your concern has arrived 10 years late." Honoria made a sharp little sound. Lydia lowered her eyes. Lady Marlborough's colour changed, then settled under powder. Alexandra kept walking because stopping would have meant choosing a side in a quarrel she had no rank to survive. Yet his answer struck through her like sudden heat through frozen fingers. Not kindness, recognition. He had seen what had been visible all along and named it in the open air. Sleet blew under the side portico in slanting silver lines. The Ashbourne carriage waited with lamps lit and steam rising from the horses' backs. A groom held the door. Another servant stood ready with blankets and a copper warming pan wrapped in flannel. The household machine had turned at one command. Edmund stirred against her shoulder and coughed once, thin but clear. "Miss Erikson." "I am here," she said. His fingers tightened in her sleeve. "Do not sit far away." "I shall not." She put one foot on the carriage step. Her wet sole slipped on brass. A hand closed around her elbow, firm and unhesitating, and steadied her until she found purchase. The Duke released her only when she was inside. He lifted Edmund from her arms and set the boy carefully on the forward seat, then took the blanket from a servant and tucked it at the child's throat with practised economy. Alexandra remained by the door, uncertain whether to sit opposite or nearest the boy. Propriety drew one line. Duty drew another. The Duke solved it without asking. "Here," he said, indicating the place beside Edmund. "Keep him upright." She obeyed and gathered the child against her side. Cold had settled so deep in her that even the carriage's trapped warmth felt distant. Her fingers did not trust themselves. When she reached to secure the blanket, the tremor returned, fine and relentless. The Duke noticed. His gaze moved from her shaking hand to her drenched skirt and then to her shoulders, where the thin wool stuck to her skin. He shrugged out of his greatcoat. She shook her head at once. "No, Your Grace, I cannot." "You can." He placed it across her lap and over Edmund both, dark wool, heavy with retained heat. "You will." "It is not proper." "It is March. You are soaked through. This is not a debate." The door shut. The coach lurched into motion. Hooves struck wet stone in a hard 4-beat rhythm, then found the smoother run toward Great Pulteney Street. Inside the carriage, lamplight swung and steadied. The Duke sat opposite, knees braced, one hand on the leather strap overhead as the wheels took a corner. Edmund's breathing rasped for a few moments, then evened. He leaned his head against Alexandra's arm. "Read," he whispered, already half asleep. "There is no book with us, Master Edmund." "Then tell the one about the sea with ice." She searched her memory and found a stanza she had translated 2 winters ago by Candle End, a northern poem about black water, lanterns in harbour fog, and a captain steering by stars no one else could see. She spoke it softly, plain English shaped by another language's bones. The lines were spare and severe. They soothed the child all the same. By the 2nd verse his jaw unclenched. By the 3rd he slept. When she fell silent, only the wheels spoke. The Duke had not moved. His profile in the carriage lamp looked carved from cold stone. Yet his eyes were not on the window or the child. They were on her face, direct enough that she felt the weight of them along her skin. "Where did you learn that poem?" "My father taught me the language. I taught myself the rest." "Swedish." "Yes, Your Grace. You translate. It was not a question." Her hand went by instinct to the sleeve that hid the torn seal fragment. "Sometimes." "For whom?" "No one of consequence." He leaned back an inch, not in retreat but in assessment. "You were struck for that letter." The statement landed with no room for evasion. She chose precision over denial. "I was struck for existing in a way that displeased Lady Marlborough. The letter was convenient." Something in his expression tightened and held. "How long has this been the arrangement?" She understood at once what he meant and feared the answer. Not years, not details, not the inventory she kept like ledgers in her own body. Any full accounting would sound like complaint, and complaint from dependent women was treated as social indecency. She looked down at Edmund's sleeping hand curled against the borrowed coat. "Long enough to become ordinary." The carriage rocked over a rut. He caught the strap, then let go slowly. "It is not ordinary." No one had ever answered her that way. Not Mrs. Davies with her silent linen, not cook with hidden tea, not gentlemen who remembered her father's bravery only when rain made them sentimental. Compassion in her world usually came wrapped in resignation. This did not. She said, because silence was suddenly harder than speech, "Ordinary and acceptable are not the same thing, Your Grace." His mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. Gone at once. "No." They rode 2 streets in quiet. Outside, Bath slid past in wet reflections. Shuttered shop fronts, lamp halos in mist. A pair of late revellers huddled under one umbrella. Inside, Edmund slept against her shoulder, warm now under the Duke's coat. Alexandra felt her own shivering begin to ease by degrees. With warmth came pain, returning to hands and cheek in clear, bright pulses. The Duke saw that as well. "Show me your palm." She stilled. "It is nothing." "Miss Erickson." The title, used correctly and without irony, disarmed her more than the command. She set Edmund carefully against the cushion and removed the glove. The linen Mrs. Davies had given her was stuck to the cut. She peeled it back. Blood had clotted in a dark seam at the base of her thumb. He did not flinch. He took a folded handkerchief from his breast pocket, white linen with a narrow black border, and held it out. "Wrap it again, tighter than that housekeeper did." She was kind to do even that. I did not criticise her kindness. I criticised the knot. Alexandra almost answered with something sharp and stopped herself. She rewound the cloth with slower care. When she finished, he nodded once, as if a practical correction had been accepted, and entered. By the time they turned through the gates of Ashbourne House, sleet had softened to cold rain. The great facade rose out of darkness in pale stone tiers, windows lit in disciplined rows. Footmen waited under the main porte-cochere, with lanterns shielded against wind. Someone had built the nursery fire exactly as ordered. She could see the orange pulse of it 2 floors above. The carriage halted. A servant reached for the door. "Not yet," the Duke said. The servant froze. Inside the carriage, Julian Thorne looked at Alexandra with a steadiness that made the small space feel smaller still. His voice dropped, stripped of public edges. "You will not return to Lady Marlborough's house tonight." Her breath caught. "Your Grace, I cannot remain here." "You can." "She will call it abduction by morning." "She may call it whatever preserves her pride. She will punish the servants in my place. She will not touch one servant in that house without a solicitor on her doorstep by noon." The certainty in his tone was almost frightening. Men of rank promised easily. Consequences landed on other people. Yet he spoke like a man listing orders already dispatched. Alexandra found the one argument that still held weight. "My reputation is already thin. If I stay under your roof, it may not survive at all." He held her gaze and answered with brutal directness. "Your reputation nearly watched you die by inches in a doorway and called it discipline." Rain ticked against the carriage roof. The words settled between them. "Irreversible," he went on, quieter. "You may choose your future arrangements in daylight, with counsel and with coin in your own hand. Tonight you choose safety. That is all." She did not trust herself to answer. No man had ever offered choice and command in the same breath. No man had ever acknowledged that daylight altered terms. Edmund shifted and made a small distressed sound in his sleep. Alexandra turned at once, set her good hand lightly to his shoulder, and began the breathing count she had used before. In for 4, hold for 2, out for 4. The child settled. When she looked up, the Duke was still watching her. He had not used the pause to press his advantage. He waited, as if her answer mattered in fact, not merely in form. By the time the hall clock struck 1, she understood that refusal would be less prudent than obedience. She also understood that agreement would change the map of her life in ways she could not yet read. "I will remain until morning," she said. "Good." He opened the carriage door himself and stepped down into rain, then turned back and offered his hand. She placed her wrapped palm in it. His grip adjusted at once to avoid the cut. The entrance hall of Ashbourne House was all stone, firelight and controlled silence. No drunken laughter, no perfume haze. Only servants in plain dark livery, moving quickly under clear instruction. A grey-haired woman in housekeeper's keys approached with a curtsy so precise it felt like respect rather than display. "Mrs. Anstruther," the Duke said, "prepare the blue nursery room for my nephew. Prepare the adjoining sitting room for Miss Erickson. Hot broth, dry garments. Send for Miss Bell to attend her cheek and hand." Mrs. Anstruther's eyes flicked once to Alexandra's torn glove and swollen face. She did not widen them. She did not ask questions in the hall. "At once, Your Grace." He turned to another servant. "Dispatch a note to Dr. Hale that the boy has arrived and is resting. Send a second note to Mr. Wycliffe. He is to call at 9. The footman bowed. Yes, Your Grace. External contacts set in motion. Outcomes unavoidable by morning. In Alexandra's old life, messages disappeared when they threatened the wrong person. Here they were spoken aloud in front of witnesses and repeated back as fact. They climbed the main staircase, Alexandra beside Edmund and the Duke, one step below, close enough that if she slipped, he could catch both of them. At the nursery landing, warm air met them, scented with cedar and fresh coal. A narrow bed had already been turned down for the boy. A basin steamed on a stand. Children's books sat stacked by the hearth in worn leather bindings. Edmund woke as they laid him down and clutched at Alexandra's sleeve with sudden panic. "Do not leave!" She sat on the mattress edge at once. "I am here!" The Duke stood at the foot of the bed, broad shoulders filling the lamplit doorway. He gave no soothing speech. He simply remained unmoving, while Alexandra recited the same sea poem in a near whisper, until Edmund's fingers loosened and sleep took him fully. Minutes passed, then more. No one interrupted. The fire settled low. Rain softened against the panes. Only when the child's breathing had held steady through 20 counts did Alexandra rise. Her knees nearly failed her. The Duke stepped forward one pace, stopped himself, and spoke as if every word cost him. "He has not slept through a full night since his mother died." Alexandra looked down at her bandaged hand. "I am sorry for him." "For him," the Duke repeated, and something bleak crossed his face. "Yes!" She should have offered a polite phrase. She should have curtsied and withdrawn to the adjoining room. Instead, she asked the question that had waited under her tongue since the vestibule, since his command, since the carriage. "Why are you doing this, Your Grace?" His answer came without hesitation, and once spoken it could not be recalled. "Because I saw you bleeding in a crowded room, and every person with power looked away except you." He did not move aside from the doorway. "Stay where I can see you tonight, Miss Erikson." Alexandra felt the words settle over her like another layer of wool, heavy and inescapable. She inclined her head once, because anything fuller would have sounded like surrender. "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Anstruther entered a moment later with Miss Bell, a compact woman with silver spectacles and a box of salves that smelled of camphor and lavender water. The Duke stepped back into the corridor but did not go far. His shadow held the threshold while Miss Bell cleaned Alexandra's split palm, bound it in fresh linen, and pressed a cool cloth to the swelling on her cheek. No one asked for explanations. No one told her she had imagined what had happened. When the dressing was done, Mrs. Anstruther placed a plain dark gown and warm stockings on the chair, then set broth and bread by the hearth in the adjoining sitting room. "Eat while it is hot, miss," the housekeeper said quietly. "Dr. Hale has sent word already. Master Edmund is to be woken every 2 hours. His breathing remains the only concern." The first external message had returned exactly as ordered. Alexandra sat because her knees would not hold another minute, lifted the spoon with her uninjured hand, and swallowed slowly until warmth reached her chest. Through the half-open door she could see the child sleeping, one arm flung above the blanket. Beyond him, in the corridor, the Duke stood where he had said he would stand, facing outward like a guard at a gate. At 9 the next morning, Mr. Wycliffe arrived. The solicitor was a narrow man with ink on 2 fingers and eyes too careful to waste motion. He bowed to Alexandra in the blue morning room as if she were already a client rather than a dependent taken in overnight. The Duke remained by the mantel, coat buttoned, expression unreadable. "Miss Erikson," Mr. Wycliffe said, opening a leather folio. "His Grace informs me that you may hold records concerning Captain Erikson's estate and Lady Marlborough's administration. If such records exist, I require chain of custody. Dates, locations, any witnesses to retrieval. Alexandra's pulse kicked hard. The hat box under the attic eaves had felt like a private madness for so long that hearing it described in legal terms made it abruptly real. "They exist," she said, "in an old hat box beneath the north slope at Marlborough House attic, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden under winter shawls. Copies in my hand from original ledgers." The Duke spoke to a footman at once. "Send 2 men with Mrs. Anne Struther and Miss Erickson's written authorization. They will retrieve the box and nothing else." By noon, the men returned with the hat box, damp at one corner and tied with fraying ribbon. Mrs. Davies came with it, breathless from the climb into the carriage, her apron still dusted with flour. She curtsied in the servants' hall and then, when Alexandra reached her, clasped her uninjured hand once in both of hers. "I told them where the loose board was, miss," she whispered. "No one saw but cook, and cook sees nothing she cannot season." In the library, under full daylight, Alexandra untied the ribbon and lifted out the packets. Each page smelled faintly of smoke and old candle wax. Columns marched in her own neat script, beside copied signatures and dates. Mr. Wycliffe read in silence for a long minute, then another. He selected 3 sheets and laid them flat. "These transfer orders bear Sir Marlborough's name on days he was documented in Surrey," he said. "The pressure pattern differs. The receiving firms are shell entries. This is sufficient to petition immediate injunction and a review of guardianship disbursements." The second external contact resolved, before she had finished absorbing the first, law in motion, not rumour. By the 3rd day of March's final week, Lady Marlborough arrived at Ashbourne House in daylight fury and silver silk. She swept into the green drawing-room with Lydia half a step behind, and Honoria fluttering at the edge of outrage. Lavender preceded them. The Duke did not rise from his place near the window. Alexandra stood by the escritoire with Mr. Wycliffe's folio closed under her hand, spine straight though her bandaged palm throbbed. "You have gone too far, Your Grace," Lady Marlborough said. "You harbour my dependent, interfere with my household, and circulate slander through Bath." The Duke's voice was level. "Miss Erickson is not your dependent. She is the aggrieved party in a financial petition filed this morning." Lady Marlborough's fan snapped open. "On forged papers copied by an unwell girl." Alexandra met her gaze. "Copied from your ledgers. In your hand where convenient, in another where necessary." Honoria gave a thin laugh. "You expect society to credit her over our mother?" Mr. Wycliffe answered before Alexandra could. "Society is immaterial. Chancery prefers arithmetic." Lady Marlborough took one step toward Alexandra, hand rising as if habit had outrun judgment. The Duke crossed the room between one breath and the next, and placed himself squarely between them. "You will not touch her again." Silence followed, hard and immediate. Lydia looked from his face to Alexandra's, and then down. Whatever calculation had once sharpened her expression now flattened into self-preservation. She offered no confession, no defence, and no warning afterward. Whatever she knew, she carried it back out in silence, and it never altered the record. Lady Marlborough lowered her hand by degrees. "You mistake gratitude for permission, Your Grace." "Good," he said. "I am courting her under my protection, and your accounts are under legal review." Honoria made a startled sound. Lydia closed her eyes briefly. Alexandra did not move. The room felt suddenly too bright, every edge etched in glass. Lady Marlborough drew herself upright, gathered her daughters with a glance, and withdrew without curtsy. 3 days passed before the hearing. Chancery smelled of wet wool, paper, and old stone. The same social faces from the assembly rooms occupied benches, with practised boredom that turned to hunger when names they recognised were called. Alexandra sat beside Mr. Wycliffe, gloved left hand over right to hide the healing wrap. The Duke stood behind her shoulder for the full session and never once sat, though seats were offered twice. Clerks read entries, dates were compared against travel logs and bank receipts. Mrs. Davies testified in a voice barely above a murmur that she had seen Lady Marlborough remove original ledgers from the study on nights when no steward was present. Captain Ericsson's old acquaintance from Queen's Square appeared with shipping correspondence proving delayed cargo payments had been converted into personal loans by later amendment. One by one, the strange details that had lived only in Alexandra's attic pages were named in public and fixed to the court record. By late afternoon, the magistrate issued temporary orders. Control of Alexandra's maternal settlement revoked from Lady Marlborough, pending full accounting. Interim income restored to Alexandra directly. All disputed transfers frozen. Lady Marlborough left through the side corridor, lips bloodless beneath powder. No one followed. Rain had begun again when they stepped onto the court stairs. The Duke held his hat in one hand and looked at Alexandra with that same unflinching steadiness. "You are free of her house!" The words did not feel triumphant. They felt precise, like a lock turning. A week later, Alexandra stood in the bookseller's back office on Cheap Street, with the torn seal fragment and 2 clean translations in her satchel. Mr. Bellamy, thin and ink-stained, adjusted his spectacles and read the first page under the window light. "This is exacting work, Miss Ericsson," he said finally. "Not merely literal. You kept the weather in it." He set down 6 shillings, then 6 more as retainer, and wrote her name into the commission ledger in full. "Payment monthly. If you wish anonymity in print, we can arrange initials only." "I wish my name," she said. He nodded once and entered it without comment. By Michaelmas, the map of Bath had changed around her. Lady Marlborough had withdrawn to a reduced dower house near Frome with 1 maid and declining invitations. Honoria married a minor baronet in haste. Lydia left for an aunt in Devon and sent no letters. Mrs. Davies accepted a post at Ashbourne Hall and kept the keys to the still room with serene authority. Mr. Wycliffe delivered final papers at Ashbourne's long library table. Settlement restored, debt manipulations voided, Alexandra legally independent whether she married or did not. On the morning she and the Duke stood before the chapel rail at Ashbourne Hall, there were no gasps, no spectacle, only witnesses chosen for loyalty over rank. Mrs. Anstruther in dove grey, Mr. Wycliffe with ink still on his cuff, Dr. Hale solemn as a parish judge, Edmund in a navy coat, throat scarf faded to a pale line, fingers ink-smudged from morning copywork. When the vows were spoken, Julian Thorne's voice did not soften, but it did not waver. Alexandra answered in the same steady cadence she had used reading by a nursery fire. Mutual consent, plainly given, heard by all. At breakfast after, sunlight reached across the long table and lit the silver tea service. Edmund sat between them with a napkin tucked crookedly at his collar. He studied his spoon, then looked up at Alexandra with fierce concentration. "Aunt Alexandra," he said carefully, each word distinct, "will you read with me after lessons?" It was his first full sentence without a break. She set down her cup. "Yes, after lessons." Julian's hand, resting near hers on the linen, did not quite touch. Then his fingers shifted the width of a breath and covered her bandaged knuckle scar with quiet finality. Around them, no one spoke for a moment. No one needed to. The house had learned her silence was not emptiness, but measure, and when she finally chose to speak, Every person at that table listened.